Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar on harnessing the collective superpower of inclusion. My name's Sarah Bond and I'm a consultant on organisational development and change, inclusion and diversity. And I'm also pleased to be director of Conference Board's Diversity and Inclusion Council for Europe, which, as some of you may know, is a peer-to-peer exchange forum for leaders on diversity and inclusion. I'm going to be the host and moderator for today's session, and it's great to have you all with us. Before we begin, just want to share with you some practicalities about today's webinar. Really wanted to encourage you to make the most of today's webcast. And the first thing is, please do ask questions of us as we go through today's session. The questions you can drop them into the chat box at the bottom, and we'll try to weave them into the conversation as we go or follow them up at the end of the session. The second thing is, please feel free to download the presentation via the file download pod in the bottom center of your screen. I think you can all see it there. You can also, if it's easier, access the full screen at any point by clicking on the 4 arrows in the top right-hand side of your screen. Do please complete the evaluation at the end. It's really helpful to us so that we can incorporate your feedback in future webinars. And of course, feel free to share this program with your colleagues. It will be available on demand after the webcast via Conference Board's website. Just one other kind of practicality before we get going. In terms of CPD credits, if that's what you're interested in, please do click the link in the CEU request pod at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to sign up for credits. You'll need to stay online for the whole webcast, but I'm hoping you'll be doing that anyway. So that's how you can earn the credits for the session. Okay, with those practicalities over, let's get on to the business of today's conference board webinar. I'm so pleased to have with me here today Alison Maitland and Rebecca Steele, who are colleagues and co-authors of an exciting new book, Indivisible, Radically Rethinking Inclusion for Sustainable Business Results. You can see a copy of it here. We're going to be talking today about some of the key messages from the book. But before we get into that, let me tell you a bit about each of them and a few thoughts about the book itself. So Alison is a writer, speaker, advisor, and coach. She specialises in leadership, inclusion, and the changing world of work, and has co-authored 2 previous books, Future Work and Why Women Mean Business. Alison's a long-serving journalist, or was a long-serving journalist with the Financial Times, and she's a senior fellow in human capital at the Conference Board, and a senior visiting fellow at the Business School, formerly CAS in London. Alison, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
And Rebecca. Rebecca's a business strategist, innovator, and speaker with deep expertise in inclusion and diversity. Following 2 decades in the corporate world, Rebecca launched her consultancy focusing on the intersection of diversity, inclusion, and human-centered design thinking. She helps leaders in business, government, and non-profit organisations bring what I know is progressive strategies to life via her signature DEI Innovation Labs and distinctive ecosystem design process. And Rebecca's also a senior fellow and council director with the Conference Board. And I'm so looking forward to our conversation with you both.
Oh, thank you, Sarah.
So, great to have you here. So listen, the book, Indivisible, Radically Rethinking Inclusion for Sustainable Business Results. What an awesome title for a book. It was published earlier this year, pre the pandemic, I think that's right. And it's a really good read. It's a really useful tool for anyone interested in diving deep into how to make progress on inclusion and diversity. But it's not just a tool. One of the things that I really appreciated about it is that it combines thought-provoking ideas about what it really takes to make progress on inclusion. It pushes our thinking about how inclusion could be compared with how it is typically approached. And it places particular emphasis on a collective whole system approach to change, and we'll be talking about that in a lot more detail. But it does all that, combines all of that with questions and actions and step-by-step guidance for senior leaders, managers, and indeed anybody in organizations about how they, or in fact we, can actually go about building more inclusive organizations. So I really can't recommend it highly enough. But I wanted to start this webinar by asking you a question about a phrase that you use in the book itself. We called this webinar Harnessing the Collective Superpower of Inclusion, and we were inspired to give the webinar that name by this phrase that you use, the collective superpower of inclusion. And I wondered if we could start off by maybe painting a picture for the people who are listening into this webinar about what that means. You know, so what does it look like when organizations harness their collective superpower? What would I be seeing? What would I be experiencing if I was in that organization? And what might it look like if organizations harnessed their collective superpower across organizations? I'd love to have your thoughts on that.
Wonderful. What a great way to start. When inclusion flourishes, it really permeates the whole work environment, and it has a positive impact on everyone, and everyone's enabled to succeed without leaving anyone out. So it also then has a positive impact on people's desire to work with an organization and how productive they are, and things like the quality of their decision making, customer relations, reputation, revenue, and a lot more. And that means inclusion builds more sustainable organizations. And I think this does describe our ambitious vision, but it's also very realistic. And we demonstrate that in the book with research evidence, but also examples from our own work with companies, showing how inclusion really does link to business and to social impact as well. And I'd like to share a few examples of the ways I see this alive in organizations to paint that picture. These are examples from organizations that we work with, and it involves things like, people being really skilled and actively building connections and combining different ideas and perspectives and strengths for important outcomes like innovation. And they're in the habit of questioning assumptions and employing things like restorative justice mindsets to build and also maintain healthy and productive relationships. But it's more than that. It's also about, for example, research and design teams pulling a broad array of insights and ideas from different people to co-create breakthrough products, servicing new or even overlooked markets. And then just like the design of so many products and services are customized for different customers today, we also see roles in organizations being designed and tailored for different people. We see a full range of people participating and having a say in how the organization should work. And we see that helping refine the structures and systems that shape the organization, and not only shape it, but keep it open to everyone. And these companies also invest in including a full range of external stakeholders. So inclusion isn't limited to who's inside, but also to people like suppliers and contractors and even investors who will buy the company's shares because of its inclusive reputation and because that reputation is attracting both talent and markets. So, more than this handful of examples to try to paint this picture, ultimately these inclusive organizations that we work with are sort of a crucible for powerful connections and contributions and co-creation. And Alison, what can you add about our collective vision that Sarah asked about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was wonderfully put, Rebecca. And I think beyond inclusion, sort of inside organisations, so we're also seeing in this picture that we're painting, companies really taking collective action. So collective action to tackle exclusion, to build bridges, to really enhance inclusion across societal divides as well. Just as many leading companies are doing today with environmental sustainability and addressing climate change. I was very struck by something that Paul Polman, the former chief executive of Unilever, said the other day. He said that businesses cannot survive in societies that fail. And so, what we're looking at really is, building on some existing industry-led initiatives. We envisage a collection of what you could call inclusion pioneers, and actually we decided to call them the InCore, and these are companies that are or will be leading action to really sort of address, systemic social and economic inequities. For example, in education systems, in healthcare, or in access to jobs and to pay, to fair pay. So these organizations are demonstrating a purpose, which organizations clearly have to do these days. And they're also making a real impact that externally, that also enhances how well they can do inclusion inside their organizations.
Thank you so much for that. And it's such a exciting picture that you've painted that looks at, just in the way that you've described inclusion inside organizations, and then this sort of sense of a collective of organizations bringing about societal change. That's a really exciting vision. I just want to ask you though about how you're defining inclusion. I know you say in the book that the term inclusion sometimes feels fuzzy and it can often be hard to put into words. And I mean, I know we all know from our work with organisations that that's a feeling that's often shared. That what does it mean, inclusion? And I wondered if you could give people who are listening, some sort of insights into how you define inclusion and also how it's different from diversity. I know the two often get confused.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really is important to be clear about what we mean, and partly I think because actually the words inclusion and diversity can be interpreted in slightly different ways in different cultures, for one thing, and secondly because they do actually often get quite confused. People talk about diversity and inclusion, and the inclusion part of it is quite often an afterthought. Indeed, quite often it's a poor relation. The fact is that diversity and inclusion are different from each other. They're complementary. They're essential to each other, but they are different. And so, we define diversity. So, just to be specific about that first, as the vast mix of different people, different individuals, identities, backgrounds, perspectives, strengths, and so on, that are a reality actually in society, a reality in the workforce, and an enormous opportunity for organizations to really to seize the benefit of that diversity. And inclusion, by contrast, is really seizing that opportunity. So it is harnessing the collective superpower and doing that by creating environments in which everyone can flourish, everyone can thrive, in which every voice is heard, in which everyone truly matters, everyone is truly valued. And actually the value of everyone is inextricably linked, indivisibly linked with the success of the organization itself. And so the important thing is really that without inclusion, diversity is unfulfilled potential. And so that's why we really focus on inclusion in the book.
That's a great way of putting it. Can I just ask you about a couple of other words that we hear in this space, one of which is equity and one of which is belonging? I know you write in the book about belonging, and I'm wondering, whether you see those two other terms kind of fitting into the picture.
I'll speak to equity, perhaps, Alison, and then you can speak to belonging. Equity is sometimes or often confused with equality. Equality really connotes that we're going to treat everybody exactly the same. But that doesn't work because, as Alison just pointed out, there's a lot of diversity in people, and so people are not exactly the same. So equity takes that into account and looks to treat people the way that they want and need to be treated. And it also involves ensuring that nothing irrelevant gets in the way of people and their opportunities and rewards at work or in society. What about belonging, Alison?
Yeah, well, belonging, we've heard a lot, and we do hear a lot about belonging as a new word, in a sense, a kind of buzzword. alternative buzzword to inclusion, as if people were struggling with the word inclusion, so they thought, well, what else could we call it? Well, let's call it belonging. We see a few challenges with that. I mean, one of them is that belonging itself, by calling it belonging, doesn't necessarily explain, or doesn't really explain, what are the ingredients? How do you get to that point of belonging? What do you actually need to be in place in order to have that outcome? So it's another outcome, like inclusion. It doesn't really shed more light on the issue by using a different word. And also that, I mean, belonging itself can be a little bit of a troublesome word, because we quite often feel our greatest sense of belonging as human beings in our so-called, our tribe, the people that we are most like, the people whose ideas we most agree with, the people who are most like us. So, and that can be taken obviously to an extreme where people actually exclude other people from their own group, the group to which they most feel they belong. So there are some issues with that word, and we actually think that instead of worrying too much about what you call it, we should really be focusing on how you get to that point, and that's why we write about the systemic approach to getting this right.
Well, let's sort of dive into that now then. So the book's got lots of suggestions for how to make organisations more inclusive, and I think we're going to run a poll actually now, just to ask those people who are on the call about your levels of confidence about how to increase inclusion in your organisation. So you should see coming up on the screen in front of you a poll. I understand what needs to happen for my organisation to become more inclusive. So we'll just give a couple of minutes, not a couple of minutes, a few seconds for you to complete the poll. I can see some responses still coming in. Okay, I think that looks quite stable. Could you publish the results, please? So 63% of people on the call saying they understand what needs to happen for their organisation to become more inclusive. 7% saying no, but 30%, so nearly a third of people on the call saying they're not sure. And so I think what we'd love to do is revisit that poll at the end of this session and check in with you if this session has helped with your understanding wherever you are in response to that poll. Thanks very much, everybody, for participating. Okay, so inclusion and diversity, they're really in the news at the moment, aren't they? I mean, the impact of the pandemic, COVID-19, on different demographic groups, the way it's shifted working life for so many of us, highlighted challenges around caring and working. And of course, the focus that's been shone on issues of race and racism in organisations following the police killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests and other protests around the world. It may seem to some people an obvious question, but I'm really keen to hear what you have to say about why does it matter for organisations to get this right? Rebecca.
That's a very good setup of the context that businesses are facing enormous pressures with, the disruptive global challenges that you mentioned with the pandemic and the economy and climate crisis and so forth, plus those shifting social expectations from a variety of stakeholders, employees, customers, investors, really demanding that structural systemic change and more. But when inclusion is indivisibly woven into how organizations operate, it plays a role in addressing those pressures. And, while the business case for diversity is pretty well aired at this point, the wealth of evidence of inclusion's impact on business opportunities seems less well known. But, as we present in the book, inclusion does have a very positive impact on what we call the 3 Ps, including performance in things like innovation, customer relations, revenues, risk, and so forth. And Alison, will you continue with the other 2 Ps?
Yes, absolutely. So the other 2 are about preparedness, really, organizations being prepared for the challenges and opportunities ahead. and the third P is purpose. I mean, if we look at the slide here, we've listed, or we've summarized some of the key things that we talk about in the book, and go into obviously in much more detail. But I mean, if we just took one of those things in the preparedness column, we're looking at higher level human skills. And what we're talking about here is the kind of skills that we all need really to enhance, to burnish, to be good at, if we are to survive and thrive alongside smart machines in the future. Things like, these are really interpersonal skills, things like, being able to be very flexible, being able to have social influence, emotional intelligence, things like that. And so and these are all really so bound up with inclusive behavior and inclusive skills. So if you're investing as an organization in your whole workforce, in inclusive skills in your whole workforce, which is obviously what we advocate, then you are investing really for your workforce to be well equipped for the future. And then I'll just highlight one other thing in the third column, the column about purpose, which is so important now for organizations to really articulate they do have a purpose. They do stand for something that's beyond profit. And this is really, I mean, there's a lot of pressure now from investors, from regulators on companies to be much more, and boards, to be much more clear about particularly, not just environmental issues, not just governance issues, but also the social issues. So in environmental, social and governance investment, there is much more emphasis now on the social part of that. And that means, how are your people? How are your people achieving their potential? And inclusion is absolutely at the heart of that.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the things as I look at that slide is that the emphasis on the contribution of inclusion to preparedness and to purpose, I think, is a really new insight, particularly around preparedness. So thank you so much for that. I mean, I think that the broad business case for inclusion is very clear. Certainly to me and to many people on this call, I'm sure. And there's lots of evidence of this in the book, as you've just shared. But at the same time, you also say in your book that many companies pay lip service to inclusion. And I guess one of the indicators that many companies do continue to pay lip service to inclusion is that it's often under-resourced compared to other business drivers. And I think we wanted to run a poll to ask participants in this webinar exactly about this question of resourcing. So the question that we wanted to get your view on is, in your organisation, does inclusion receive the same treatment as any other business priority, any other business driver? So I can see the numbers are slightly shifting on the screen, but it's overwhelmingly a no from people. Just wait a minute for the numbers to settle.
And it's interesting that that some people are saying that it does receive the same treatment, albeit
Yes.
it's a smallish number who's saying that. But that
Yes.
is interesting, and perhaps those people may be willing to share something in the chat as we go along about what it is that your organisation is really doing, and how it is achieving that, treating, resourcing, paying attention to inclusion in exactly in the same way as it would those other business drivers. It'd be really interesting to hear from you as well.
Yeah, that's a great comment, Alison. So we'll just wait for, I can see people are typing at the moment. Let's come back to some of those comments and bring them into the discussion. Thank you everybody for completing the poll. So just on this question of the business case, I was just reading a really great article in Harvard Business Review called "How to Promote Racial Equity in the Workplace" by Robert Livingston, and it's in the September-October issue. And this article describes 5 steps to racial equity. And what really grabbed my attention about it is that not one of them is about building the business case. And instead, what this article conveys is that it's empathy rather than the business case that's the real driver for change. And it's not about, what the article is saying is it's not really about does inclusion generate enough return on investment, but the big issue is whether leaders care enough. And I guess the question that I wanted to ask you, Rebecca and Alison, is the fact that we have to keep going back to the business case, as you do in the book, so eloquently. Does that suggest that leaders and organizations are just not empathetic enough?
It's a really good question. I mean, I thought that was a really interesting article, and it does go, to the heart of a sort of behavioural change and what that takes. And I mean, empathy is, it is a really different thing from sympathy. It's about experiencing, really feeling that sense of, the emotion or the experience that another person has had, maybe the same anger or hurt or grief, and of course that takes a lot of emotion and energy in itself. It does seem to be, it does seem to be a differentiator for the companies that are really, advancing well on inclusion and indeed actually resourcing inclusion strategies and their commitments and tying inclusion to their business goals and outcomes. So the two things are not totally separate. But I think it's important also to recognize that, we can't legislate for every leader to be empathetic or every person to be naturally empathetic. Some people are more naturally so than others are. And so what I'd say is that it's really important that you make sure that within your leadership team or within any team in an organization, you do have people who have that quality naturally, who can do it naturally and will point it out to others, will point out when it's needed. But there's another part of this, which is that sort of empathy with what's going on in society around you. It's not just a nice to have, because if you're an organization, if you're as an organization, you're not tuned into what's happening in the society, in the communities in which your organization is operating, you actually aren't really earning what's called your social license to operate. And if you're not earning your social license to operate, which needs to be constantly renewed, then you're not going to be a sustainable organization.
And I guess that's about organisations not being part of the whole system approach, which you're going to come and talk about later. Okay, so let's just explore a little bit. Given these reasons, all the good reasons for leaders and organisations to take inclusion seriously, I'm wondering what it is that's holding organisations back, because the reality is we know that, just as I can see in the chat in front of us, there are many organisations that are doing work on inclusion and are making progress, but there are also many that are not. So I'm curious to know, what is it that holds organisations back from making progress, maybe even when they want to?
Yeah.
I don't know what either of you think about that.
Among many reasons, I'd say 3 at the top are: first, not linking inclusion to business goals, core business priorities. And the second would be reliance on things that are called best practices that are actually often ineffective. It's a very strange piece of DEI these days. And also the third, I'd say, is taking piecemeal approaches. So sort of taking isolated initiatives instead of a cohesive, comprehensive strategy like we do with other business drivers. So I think these and other barriers are in large part because of limited understanding of what inclusion really is, how to cultivate it and how to create value with it, and how to measure inclusion and its impacts. And, we kind of summarize it with this slide here that inclusion often is thought of as really just a focus on individuals and their feelings, usually their feelings of belonging, and only those individuals inside an organization, and sort of as an end to itself or some addition or nice to have, but disconnected from business impact.
That's such a good slide. I mean, as I look at that slide, I feel it describes many approaches to inclusion that I've encountered. That focus on the individual, as you say, about feelings, internal and disconnected. I think that's a great slide. So if that's the case, then those are some of the barriers. I'm wondering, what does it take to create this world of inclusion, this kind of collective superpower that was such a compelling description that you gave at the beginning? What can people on this call do? What are the enablers here?
Well, one thing to think about is, I mean, we've already made the point that, inclusion is about more than just, a feeling of belonging. In fact, that can be a little bit unhelpful sometimes, that word, or indeed just, feeling valued in an organization. It's so much more than that. And it's really important that we, understand all of the components and understand how they connect with each other as well, in order to really sort of create the outcomes and the impact that we want to achieve, that companies really want to achieve with their DEI strategies. And so in our research, we looked at how inclusion plays out in lots of different scenarios across different sectors and in different settings. And we came up with what we call these 10 enablers of inclusion. These are things that really need to be in place in an organization in order to achieve a truly inclusive work environment. And we clustered them in these three clusters of creating connection, opportunity, and common cause. Now, some of these will be, things that are pretty familiar to people, perhaps openness, respect, maybe fairness, those kind of things that you would definitely associate naturally with inclusion. And then there are some that might be a little bit less familiar. For example, in the creating common cause, the shared power concept. And that's really about how is power distributed in an organization? Is it distributed, or is it actually just concentrated in a few hands? It's about exercising power with people rather than exercising power over them. And that entails quite a big, reframe or rethink for a lot of organizations. Similarly with participation isn't just, being part of an organization, but it's about having, the resources and the opportunity to actually shape that organization, how it operates, to find better ways for it to operate, to co-design and to have a voice in all of those things. So these 10 enablers, so how can you actually sort of use them in a practical way? And we've got a slide here which just, helps maybe to talk through how these 10 enablers can be used. Now, we look at it from the point of view of what senior leaders can do, and this is just one example. So senior leaders could start a mutual mentoring relationship with somebody in the organization who's different from them. And you could both be focusing on how to become more inclusive leaders, whatever level you're at, and use those 10 enablers as a starting point, as a discussion point. How can I engender more trust in this organization? Or how can I, as a senior leader, actually share the power that I have more? So that's one way to do it. And then with middle managers, we have a suggestion for how middle managers can use this. Middle managers are such an important part of organizations and of enabling inclusion in organizations, and often they get left out of the equation, or get left out or blamed for preventing inclusion from happening. But actually there's so much that middle managers can do. But anyway, this is one suggestion, that you work as a middle manager on all those three sets of enablers when you're working on a critical performance task, a critical business objective, to increase collaboration within your team. And we also have something for individuals that they can do. So this would be about really looking at those 10 enablers within your team, with your colleagues, and looking at, so what are we good at? Are we good at transparency? Are we good at trust? Where are the gaps? What are we not so good at? And how can we start to address those gaps as a team and individually? And in the book, we've got about 50 different actions for people to take at every level, because, inclusion, as we said, really is about everyone in the organization has a role to play. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I can just add, those 10 enablers are an important component, a part of our step-by-step whole system approach. So these are really critical, and there's a lot more to it, and we'll get to that in our discussion, I think.
That's great. I mean, just if we could go back, we just go back to the 10 enablers slide just for 1 second.
Oops.
As we look at that slide, what really occurs to me, particularly I think, Alison, when you were talking about shared power and participation, is that inclusion is really, inviting a massive cultural shift within organisations. So something like how power is shared, how participation happens. That's really inviting people at all levels, all the levels that you've described, to behave in very, very different sorts of ways. And it really struck me when I looked at this slide that was what the invitation to people is in your book.
And it is already happening in some organizations. It is already embodied in some of the really great leadership examples that we've seen during the coronavirus pandemic. Of course, there have been some terrible leadership examples as well. But, it's not an impossibility. It's there, and it's very much about leadership for the future, for the new reality that we're in. And it's actually also about what people coming into the workforce these days are looking for and expecting. So there are lots of different reasons why, it's a big change maybe for some organizations, but it's kind of, on trend.
Yeah. Thank you. Brilliant. Okay, so we've talked a bit about this, or at least we've mentioned a couple of times, a whole system approach, and we've got a poll coming up about involvement or experience in systems thinking. Before we just take the polls, can I just ask Rebecca, could you explain to people what systems thinking means from your point of view?
It might be helpful to just compare it or contrast it to piecemeal thinking or piecemeal approaches. So if you think of, for example, how a tree gets to be really healthy and thriving and tall in a forest, it can't be just because it only has sunlight or only has water, it only has protection from predators, it only has nutrient soil. It needs to have all of those things, and those things all have to work in conjunction rather in pieces rather than one at a time, for example. So systems thinking resists breaking things down into pieces and parts and looks at things as a whole and how all the components of a whole need to be mutually reinforcing around what you're looking to gain, for example, inclusion. Is that helpful?
That's incredibly helpful. That's a great analogy. Thanks so much. So the poll that we wanted to ask people is how many of your organization's leaders currently excel in systems thinking? Okay. It's once the figures settle, we'll publish the results, please. So few, a fifth, some almost 60%, which is really encouraging. Most 6%, and then not sure. The remainder not sure. What do you make of the results of that poll, Rebecca or Alison?
Yeah, it is a lot of what we tend to see, whether it has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, or other things in businesses. We do see kind of a pattern of a dearth of understanding or application of systems thinking, and more of an approach that looks at pieces and parts and silos, and it really is very limiting. as we're focused on inclusion, we know that a systems approach is the kind of thing that really leads to widespread and sustainable and business-linked outcomes with inclusion.
And what are the, sorry, Rebecca, I interrupted
go
you,
ahead.
please. I was just going to ask you kind of what are the risks of taking a piecemeal approach?
Yeah, well, it's like the analogy that I talked about. What we see is that we're kind of overburdening individuals to have the right awareness, motivation, and capabilities to overcome what is reinforcing the status quo, rather than having everything in the organization pointing in the same direction to say this is clearly signaling, supporting, structuring in, institutionalizing that inclusion is going to be how we all show up every day and how the organization works to achieve its mission.
Yeah, so you can, and we've got some case studies in the book about the kind of risks that you run as an organization if you fail to take account of inclusion in, say, in your design processes. You can miss out on a chunk of your market because you completely missed them, because you haven't had a diverse design team that's really thinking about who are we missing, who might we be missing when we're designing this new product. That's one example, and then of course to another extreme of actually facing lawsuits for harassment, or so you may have wonderful diversity and inclusion values and mission and lip service, and then you hit a lawsuit because you're actually not, this isn't really integrated into the way that you operate as an organization.
Great, thank you. And it would be really interesting, I think, to hear from people on the call whose organizations are taking a systems thinking approach on inclusion and diversity. So if any of you out there would define or describe your company's approaches on inclusion and diversity in that way, please do let us know. We'd love to hear from you. So, Rebecca and Alison, what's your offering? So what are you proposing as an alternative to a sort of piecemeal approach?
Right. Well, we looked at these limitations on this slide earlier, and we see this showing up in a lot of organizations that aren't yet taking an indivisible approach, a systems approach. And this is very common. And part of the way we detect that is to look at scorecards on inclusion. So the one we're showing now is very common, and many organizations feel like it suffices to show an organization how inclusive it is today. But it's really rather shallow, and it leaves out a lot of insight that leaders need to make decisions about inclusion and their broader business. So it's really interesting to look at a scorecard like that and say, what is it not telling us? Is it really telling us fully how inclusive we are today and what kind of progress we're making? Is it showing us what initiatives and strategies are actually leading to good outcomes and giving us a good return on what we're investing in inclusion? And is it telling us what things we should stop doing in order to promote inclusion further? Is it telling us, how widespread and sustainable the results are, including not only internally but externally as well, and in ways that are actually helping a business achieve its purpose and goals? So, we're looking at overcoming that by taking what we call the inclusion impact approach, which is the indivisible whole system approach to inclusion, where, different to those limitations we saw earlier, we're looking at the who about inclusion is everyone. It's senior leaders and middle managers and individuals and teams, of course. It's more than feelings. It's also actions and behaviors, plus the structures and systems and signals that either help or hinder inclusion. It's not just internal, it's also external stakeholders and external dynamics that we need to pay attention to. It needs to be continuous, in part because inclusion is part of every interaction, and it's not a once and done kind of thing that you achieve and then move on from. And also to make sure that we're really clear on how this links to business impacts and larger societal impacts as well. This is the whole system approach. Sometimes upon introduction, it seems daunting, but it's really easily applicable to an immediate business priority. And if it's useful, we could share an example of how this could be applied in practice.
I think that would be really useful. Thanks, Rebecca.
Sure. So, one important issue that a lot of organizations are facing today is the distributed workforce. And goodness, it doesn't look like the complete slide is showing up here for some reason, but I can still talk through it. Oh, that's better.
There you go.
Don't know what happened.
Yeah.
Oh well, fine. That's not exactly what I had planned, but it's okay. So part of what this slide does is it illustrates a really simple example of how you could take an ecosystem approach to including distributed workers. And you can see the components of our ecosystem framework are listed on the left-hand side. And part of what we do in an ecosystem strategy is to look to address each of those components on how it would support including distributed workers. So the first thing is just to make it clear that distributed workers and inclusion of distributed workers is going to actually help our business with things like continuity, with cutting cost, with productivity, safety, and more. But we also need to make sure that we don't stop there, and we add to it a really clear strategy to make it crystal clear to leaders what is required of them in order to promote inclusion of distributed workers. And so in this organization, we might say that promotion to leadership actually requires being skillful in inclusive communication and empathy and building trust and some of the other things that we talked about earlier. So it's really clear to leaders that those competencies are a requirement, or else you're not going to be a leader in this organization. Also, everyone in the organization, leaders but others at all levels in the organization, need to have capabilities that support distributed working. So we might need to ensure that there's some kind of development that improves skills and things like the technology that helps us connect and collaborate through distributed work situations. And also, working with a diverse mix of people across different teams and cultures and locations and so forth. And the organization structure, often represented by an org chart, might need to include institutionalizing special teams that are formed to really enhance distributed working and to find any barriers that might be getting in the way and helping to address those. Of course, there are loads of processes in any organization, but we might, for example, need some formal process to ensure that everyone's getting the technology that they really need, and that it takes account of each person's needs so that it can enable everyone's voice to be heard. Individual beliefs and habits are also a really important component of the system. Sometimes we hear people sort of debating whether we need to take a systems approach and change systems or more of an individual approach. I have trouble understanding them because I think they're related. Individual beliefs and habits are part of the system. They impact the system, and the system also impacts individual beliefs and habits. But in this case, we'd want to make sure that employees had the experiences at work that could make them really just take for granted that working in a range of locations is a positive career choice and would lead to opportunities and rewards instead of limit them, as we've often seen in the past in traditional organizations. We need to take into account metrics and rewards. And so maybe we'd say in this organization, leaders are assessed on how well they support individuals working in any location. And then, connecting that to the positive business results that this actually creates. We condensed all the external factors into one bucket just for this example, but you can see how business travel and carbon emissions and so forth are reduced, and that would then align with the climate regulations and changing workforce expectations around that. So what happens then is, instead of just sort of taking a piecemeal approach, we've addressed all the components to line up with inclusion of distributed workers. And we're doing that in a way that's ultimately going to be mutually reinforcing and showing the interdependence and the interconnection among all those components, so that, again, everywhere employees look, they're seeing that including distributed workers is something that is happening around the organization and reinforced everywhere they look.
So that's really interesting. So, I think a piecemeal approach was the word you used, might be to look, say, just at processes. So it might be to try to shift more, drive progress on inclusion through looking just at processes. Or it might be just looking at individual beliefs or habits, through something like unconscious bias. Or it might be just looking at what a leader's doing. And this ecosystem approach gives people 8 interconnected um, uh, kind of areas that they need to take into account in order to maximize the chances of making real progress on inclusion and diversity. That's what this is saying?
Exactly. And we do see that if we overlook one of these components, or we don't
Yeah.
ensure that the components are mutually reinforcing, that we actually are leaving legacies in place that reinforce the status quo instead of the way we need things to be.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's also, there's, it's like the previous slide that Rebecca showed briefly. It's a kind of like a circular system. It's like a virtuous circle, because everything does feed off each other. So everything is interconnected and all driving in the same direction. So yeah, the virtuous circle concept, I think, is quite useful as well.
Great, thank you. So I've just wanted to ask you a question about the subtitle of the book. I really loved the boldness, the subtitle, the radically rethinking inclusion. I mean, as I read the book, there was a lot in it that I thought was kind of very progressive and radical. I really like the challenge to some of the myths about what inclusion really is. I mean, I often talk about inclusion as feelings myself, so it was kind of interesting to have that challenged in the book, and I appreciated it. I like that you say it's not just about feelings, it's not just about minority groups. I like the whole system approach. I also really like the proposal at the end for the gross world inclusion measure as an alternative to a GDP measure, so I really appreciated that. But I wondered about you as authors, what do you see as the most radical and transformative part of the book, and why?
That's a great question too. Yeah. I think it's probably helpful to think about, what our readers have highlighted, actually, about what has really sort of hit them most strongly so far. And I guess one of the big things is this whole sort of reframing of how to approach diversity, equity, inclusion as this sort of, instead of a series of disjointed initiatives, actually to have this whole integrated system approach that's been much commented on. I think the fact that that it's a book for everyone, that the middle managers are included in there as well, and individuals, and that people who've read it have said that they feel a sense that there's something that they can do, that they're not powerless in this. They can do something, and they must do something, and there are sort of actions that they can take. I think also, we talk about one element we haven't discussed today, but is about how diversity and inclusion isn't just about marginalized populations. And indeed, we mustn't expect, the burden of the work we mustn't put the burden of the work on marginalized populations to change organizations. And that it's about everyone, and it's about all of us. And that we are also not, we talk about how, we are whole identities, and that organizations need to take account of people as whole identities, instead of putting people into single identity boxes: gender, age, ability, disability, and so on. Actually, one of the things that's really been commented on quite a lot by particularly white male readers in the West, they've been struck by a section that we have, which is called "How White Men Can Show Up Whole." And it's interesting that, white men, particularly white men in leadership, are often sort of left out of diversity and inclusion initiatives, that they feel that they are left out, or expected to play a kind of role as an ally rather than an absolutely central role leading. and actually, there's evidence that as many as 45% of straight white men report covering up some element of their identity at work. It might be to do with age, or it might be their mental health, or it could be religion. There are lots of different things, but it does show that inclusion and exclusion can and do impact all of us to a greater or lesser extent. So I think that often white men in those circumstances feel or are somewhat trapped in a straitjacket, a corporate straitjacket. And they are trapped by maybe a single view of success. And so that's something that's really been picked up on. And then that whole sort of external versus internal thing that inclusion that Rebecca was talking about, that organizations aren't separate entities on their own, that they are part of this sort of interconnected and fast changing ecosystem, and so is inclusion. Rebecca, are there things that you would add to that?
Yeah, just briefly, again, hearing from people who have read the book, there's also the interest in the intersection of inclusion, innovation, and sustainability. And also with the new ways that we suggest to collect data, the new ways to measure and analyze that data, and our bold new scorecards that the companies I've been working with are finding both insightful and impactful for their boards, their executive teams, and other key decision makers.
Thank you both very much. We've just got a couple of minutes before we do the final poll, and I wanted to just check in on the chat. Melanie Brannigan has written a question. I think it was in relation to a comment that you made, Rebecca, about the barriers to progress on inclusion, and you talked around best practices, and I think some of the ways in which what's thought of as best practices actually are maybe not in reality. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Well, I could give some examples. I mean, one thing that's really interesting, I'll give one example in light of time, but yeah, it's so common for organizations to pledge and take action on unconscious bias awareness training. And there's actually really good evidence that although that's touted as a best practice, that it's not really effective in mitigating the negative effects of bias. So that's just one example. And, it's something that I think is really important in our work, particularly as it evolves and as our context for doing this work evolves. We need to be really critical thinkers to stop and ask questions about what's going to work and measure whether or not it does work for inclusions, and particularly in our own organizations.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. And Alia Kawaja has asked a question about demonstrating the business impact of inclusion in professional services. And I'm wondering, and the point being made is that it's actually harder to demonstrate the business impact of inclusion in that environment. And I'm wondering, Alison or Rebecca, what your thoughts are about that.
Well, my sort of initial reaction would be that, I think you're probably talking about things like sort of innovative products and so on. But of course, you could have innovative services, and you do have innovative services for your clients. So I suppose it's really about thinking of what are the things that you do produce as an organization in a financial or a professional services environment. What are the things that you produce? What would you like to be doing better as an organization? And actually then measuring, your inclusion efforts, what you do on inclusion, and how that helps you to achieve those things, those goals that you have. So I wouldn't have said that it was actually any more difficult. I don't know, Rebecca, do you want to add to that?
Just briefly to say that a lot of times when we find organizations saying that inclusion is difficult to measure, in part it's because they're not treating it like other business drivers and how we measure those. And we call this out particularly in the book. But if you think about how complex something like marketing measures and analytics are, or finance, or lots of other measures in organizations, what we do is we challenge ourselves to get experts to be creative and create the kinds of metrics that are going to give us the insights that we really need to make good business decisions. And we're going to invest in the kinds of technology that supports that. We don't as often see that as inclusion and with inclusion. And we see organizations kind of throwing up their hands often when if they invested in creating and following through on the metrics that are important, they can very much be addressed and can be much more insightful to organizations.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca and Alison. And as we close today's webinar, we wanted to go back to the very first poll that we put up and ask about people's understanding about what needs to happen for organisations to become more inclusive. I don't know if we've got time to run that poll just very quickly. That looks like a huge shift to me, certainly from the not sures to the yeses. So thank you so much, Alison and Rebecca, for your contribution to that, and thank you everybody for listening. Alison, Rebecca, anything you want to say by way of ending? I know we're out of time.
So I would just briefly say that many organizations are engaging in reading for action circles around the book, and there's a free to use guide on the book website, individual-or-book.com, if you'd like to know more about
that. And I'd say, yeah, we are in the midst of a massive crisis at the moment, and crises are also opportunities really to rethink how we do things and to make work, in this case, to make work more human and more successful, organizations more successful. So we would really say, take a bold, ambitious approach to inclusion in order to close the gap and harness our collective superpower.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Yeah. Thank you so much, Alison. Thank you to everybody on the webinar. Do please let us have your feedback on today's session. And thanks very much indeed for being with us today. Thank you.
Sarah.
Thank you so much.